28, stop buying deodorant. The $2 AMISH recipe that stops sweat for 48 hours. Doctors are quiet about this. The shirt is already clinging under your arm before breakfast. That tight, damp feeling you notice without looking in a mirror. You adjust it once. Then again, it doesn't help much. Outside, the porch air is warm but not honest heat yet. Still early, still forgiving, and still something already feels off for the day ahead. On the counter sits a small jar with nothing fancy about it. Baking soda dust on the lid, a spoon that's been used too many times to stay shiny. This whole thing costs less than $2. That number matters more than it should, because most store sticks now run $5, $8, even $12, and still fade before lunch if you're moving, working, sweating like men used to sweat without thinking twice about it. There's a question that keeps coming back here quietly, not loud, just steady. What if the problem was never your body at all? If this kind of plain, kitchen counter solution sounds familiar to you, stay close. Not everything worth knowing comes in a plastic tube with bright labeling. And I'd honestly like to hear what you've seen work in your own home over the years. Something simple, something your mother, father, or neighbor never bothered replacing. Share that below. And if you want more of these quiet, old working ideas pulled apart piece by piece, you'll know where to find it without much noise. The morning starts the same way it always does. Sink water running, shirt pulled over shoulders. Quiet movement before the day gets loud. But today there's a small problem you can't ignore. That damp patch under the arm already forming before anything real has even begun. It's not dramatic. It never is at first. Just a slow kind of failure you learn to recognize over the years. You remember thinking once that stronger deodorant would fix this. Better brand, higher price, longer protection. That's what they always suggest. But the pattern never really changes. It holds for a while, then it doesn't. By midday, especially in heat or hard work, it fades like chalk in rain, and you're left managing something you thought was already handled. There's a strange frustration in that, not loud anger, more like quiet disbelief that it still happens. And somewhere in that frustration, you start noticing the cost too. $5 here, $8 there, $12 for the extra strength kind that promises more than it ever delivers. It adds up without ever feeling like it improved anything. A neighbor once said something simple about it while leaning on a fence post. He wasn't trying to be clever, just observant in the way older men get. They sell you freshness, he said, not control. That line stayed longer than expected, because it starts to feel like the system isn't built to finish the problem. It's built to keep you buying the next answer, not because anyone is lying outright, but because repeating the cycle is where the money lives. There's another memory that slips in here, not fully formed yet. A kitchen shelf from years ago, not lined with products, just a few plain jars. Nothing labeled for marketing, everything labeled for use. And someone, an older relative, mentioning that we never needed half of what they sell now. No explanation, just fact. That's where the discomfort starts to shift shape, from body frustration to system suspicion. Because if your body hasn't changed, why has the solution become so complicated? And then there's the Amish mention you heard once, half casual. Out in Lancaster country, some families still keep things simpler, not as a statement, just as routine. A shelf that doesn't change much year to year. No one calls it revolutionary there, it's just what's used. And that thought doesn't resolve anything yet. It just sits with you while the day continues. Because now the question is no longer about sweating. It's about whether you were ever given the simplest answer in the first place. The strange thing about older homes is how little they change. Not out of nostalgia, out of necessity. You open a cabinet like that and it doesn't argue with you. No rows of new and improved. No shifting formulas every few years. Just a few plain things that kept showing up again and again. Soap, baking soda. Sometimes a jar of something mixed by hand, not because someone rejected modern life, but because they didn't need it to be complicated. And that contrast starts to bother you more once you notice it. Because in your own bathroom now, the shelf tells a different story. One problem, solved 6 different ways, none of them permanent. Fresh scent, clinical strength, 72-hour protection. All different words pointing at the same daily return of the same issue. Sweat is not the enemy, really. It never was. It's just the body doing what it's built to do. Cooling, clearing, staying balanced under load. The issue is what happens after. When bacteria meet moisture in time, that's where odor forms. Quietly, predictably. And every product is trying to interrupt that moment in its own way. Some mask it, some block it, some try to control it completely. but very few ever step back and ask a simpler question. What if the surface itself didn't need so much intervention? There's an old memory here that tends to surface in conversations like this. A grandfather figure, sleeves rolled up, moving through morning chores without much concern for branded things. Not because he was making a statement, but because his routine was already enough. A bar of plain soap near the sink, a towel that had seen more years than most products last month's, and a quiet habit of doing things the same way every day. No rotation, no upgrade cycle, just repetition that worked. He once said something that didn't sound important at the time, but it tends to return later in different situations. Most things don't need fixing. They just need doing right the first time. That line sits differently now, because modern personal care doesn't really feel like done once. It feels like managed constantly, and that's where the shift begins. Not toward rejection, toward simplification. A smaller shelf starts to feel less like absence and more like control returning quietly to your own hands. And that's when the idea stops being theoretical and starts becoming something you might actually try. The jar is smaller than you expect. Nothing about it looks like a solution, just glass, slightly cloudy from use, sitting near the sink where morning light hits the edge of the counter. Inside, nothing impressive, nothing branded. That's the first thing you notice. Because modern answers usually arrive loud. This one doesn't even try. You start with what most kitchens already have. Not exotic, not rare, just familiar pantry things that never left the shelf even when trends came and went. A little baking soda, a little cornstarch, a bit of oil to bind it together. That's it. No fragrance engineered in a lab. No long list of chemicals you'd need a pamphlet to explain, just dry balance and texture doing the work. You mix it slowly at first. Not because it's complicated, because your hands don't trust simple things anymore. The powder shifts under the spoon like fine dust from a barn board, soft at first, then heavier as the oil pulls it together. It changes texture in front of you, from separate parts into something that holds, not magic, just structure. The idea behind it is plain enough when you strip everything else away. Moisture feeds odor. Air and dryness slow it down. So instead of overpowering the body, you work with it. You try to reduce what causes the problem at its source. Not mask it, not fight it endlessly. Just quiet it. Some old rural households, AMISH or otherwise, depending on the region and family, kept similar logic in small jars like this. Not as a tradition they talked about, just something they did. Use what you have. Waste nothing. Keep it simple enough to repeat. That's the whole philosophy sitting under it. You press a small amount between your fingers. It feels different from store-bought sticks immediately. Less artificial glide, more grounded texture, like something that belongs to skin instead of sitting on top of it. First use is never dramatic. That's important to understand. You're not stepping into transformation. You're stepping into a comparison. Same day, same work, same heat, different starting point. And somewhere in that quiet trial, you start noticing what isn't happening. Less layering, less reapplication thinking, less checking, not perfect, not permanent, just steadier. And here's the honest limit that matters more than any promise. This won't behave the same for every body, every climate, every workload. Heavy labor in peak summer heat will still demand adjustment. Some people will prefer stronger solutions on certain days, but even that realization changes something. Because now you're choosing instead of reacting. And that's where the real shift begins to show itself. Not in the jar, in the quiet way your morning stops revolving around it. The first thing you notice isn't smell, it's absence of worry. That small mental check you used to do halfway through the day. Gone for a while, then remembered later, then gone again. No panic, no adjustment. Just less attention pulled downward. That alone changes the shape of a day. Because most people don't realize how often they're thinking about it. Not sweating itself, the management of it, reapplying, rechecking, adjusting shirts, planning around heat, tiny decisions stacked one on top of another until they feel normal. When that noise quiets even a little, you feel it elsewhere. Work feels less interrupted, movement feels less calculated, even the morning starts to feel lighter in a way that's hard to explain. And the cost stops echoing in the background too, not just money leaving your pocket, but the steady rhythm of needing to replace something every few weeks. A small jar that lasts longer than expected begins to shift that pattern. Not because it's perfect, but because it doesn't demand attention every time it runs out. There's a kind of relief in that simplicity. Not excitement. Relief. Like setting down something you didn't realize was slightly heavy until it was gone. Some people who try simple mixtures like this don't stay because of ideology. They stay because nothing pushes them back out. It just works enough to be forgotten. And that's rare now. Still, there's honesty that has to stay in place here. Hot weather will test it. Long days outside will test it. And some will go back and forth depending on season or work. That's normal. No single thing fixes a whole human routine forever. But there's something else that matters more than perfection. Control returning in small pieces. Not buying your way out of every discomfort, not building your day around a product shelf, just a simple jar, a simple mix. A quiet return to something you can make again if it runs out. That's the deeper shift most people don't talk about. Not deodorant, not sweat, but dependence. And what happens when it loosens its grip a little? If you've got something your family always kept around the house, something simple that never got replaced no matter what came out later, I'd like to hear it. Those things tell the real story more than any recipe ever could. And if there's interest, there are more of these quiet kitchen fixes worth unpacking, not as miracles, just as tools that never stopped working while everything else kept changing. Next time, there's another one worth looking at for cold weather skin and cracked hands. The kind of fix people used before store shelves started deciding everything for them. Until then, keep things simple where you can.